There is a moment, a very specific kind of moment, that belongs only to the World Cup. It comes every 4 years, and when it arrives, it is felt in living rooms and village squares and open fields and crammed coffee shops from Sao Paulo to Seoul, from Lagos to London, from a tiny mountain town in Peru to a fishing village in Iceland. It is the moment just before a penalty kick in a final. The crowd of 80,000 falls into a strange collective hush, and every one of those 80,000 people seems to hold their breath at exactly the same second. The goalkeeper shuffles nervously on his line. The kicker places the ball on the spot. And somewhere out in the dark, beyond the floodlights and the cameras and the noise, 3 billion more people are holding their breath too. That is the World Cup. That is what it has grown into over nearly a century of history. It is the largest, loudest, most watched sporting event that humanity has ever conceived. It is a tournament built on dreams, and on the quiet, grinding work behind those dreams, and on the extraordinary, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes transcendent things that happen when the best footballers in the world finally meet on a single stage. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. Slowly, gently, from the very beginning.
Before we go further, a small word from this channel. If the slow drift of history helps you find sleep, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Heyo. We are on a very meaningful journey towards 1,000 subscribers, and every single one counts more than you might imagine. If you have a little energy left before sleep takes you, leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you are listening from. Send some hype our way. It is genuinely one of the loveliest things to wake up to. Now, settle in. Let us begin. Before there were floodlit stadiums, long before there were television cameras or satellite broadcasts or online streaming, long before a single World Cup match had ever been played, there was simply the game itself. And the game was, by the last decades of the 19th century, spreading with a kind of quiet, irresistible momentum across the face of the earth.
Association football, the game we now call football or soccer, depending on where you are in the world, had been formally codified in England in 1863, when a group of clubs gathered in a London tavern called the Freemasons' Arms and agreed upon a unified set of rules. Before that meeting, the game had existed in dozens of different forms in English schools and streets, each village playing by its own customs, each institution insisting on its own particular version of what counted as a fair tackle or a valid goal. The agreement at the Freemasons' Arms changed all of that. Suddenly there was one game, one set of rules, one shared language of play. And once it had that language, it began to travel. It travelled first with British sailors and merchants and railway engineers and engineers of empire who fanned out across the world in the latter half of the 19th century, carrying the game with them the way one carries a habit or a memory. They played it on the docks of Buenos Aires and in the ports of Genoa. They played it in the highlands of Uruguay and in the trading houses of Vienna. Locals watched, joined, and then began to play themselves. Within a generation, what had been a peculiarly English pastime had become something far more universal,
something that seemed to speak to a human instinct for competition and community that crossed all language and border. By the turn of the 20th century, football was already the most popular sport in much of Europe and South America. National associations had formed in country after country. Clubs were competing in domestic leagues. International matches between national teams, tentative and informal at first, were being played with growing regularity. And then came the Olympics. Football was included at the 1900 Paris Olympics, albeit in an unofficial capacity, and then more formally in subsequent games, drawing ever larger crowds and ever greater interest. The sport was outgrowing the Olympics even as it competed within them. The man who would ultimately give football its own stage was Jules Rimet. He was born in 1873 in a small town in eastern France, and he grew up in Paris, the son of a grocer, in a city and a time when football was only beginning to take root in French life. Rimet fell in love with the game early and devoted much of his adult life to its promotion and administration. He became president of the French Football Federation in 1919, and more crucially, he became president of FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, the governing body of world football, in 1921. FIFA had been founded back in 1904 in Paris by representatives of just 7 countries, but under Rimet it began to grow into something more genuinely global. Rimet was a man of particular vision. He believed, with what appears to have been a deep and sincere conviction, that football could serve as a force for peace and international understanding, that the shared language of the game could bridge the divisions between peoples and nations. This was not a naive belief in the abstract. Rimet had lived through the First World War. He had seen what happened when nations spoke only in the language of armies. Football, he thought, might offer something different, something that required nations to meet on a field rather than a battlefield, to compete by rules rather than by force. The idea of a World Football Championship had been quietly circulating for years by the time Rimet began pushing for it in earnest. Olympic football had shown that international competition was possible and popular, but the International Olympic Committee and FIFA were increasingly at odds over the amateur status of players. The IOC insisted that Olympic competitors must be amateurs, which created enormous complications for South American countries whose best players were professional. FIFA wanted a tournament of its own, one that could include the world's genuinely finest players without restriction. On the 28th of May, 1928, at the 17th Congress of FIFA, held in Amsterdam, Jules Rimet brought the proposal formally to a vote. The organization agreed. A World Cup would be held. It would take place 2 years hence, in 1930. The question of where immediately became contentious. Several countries expressed interest in hosting, including Italy, Sweden, Spain, and Hungary. But there was one country whose case was especially compelling, a small, proud nation on the eastern coast of South America, a country that had twice won Olympic gold in football and was about to celebrate a century of its independence. That country was Uruguay. Uruguay's bid was impossible to refuse. They offered to pay the travel and accommodation expenses of every participating team, no small commitment in 1930, a year by which the Great Depression had settled over the global economy like a cold, heavy fog. They offered to build a magnificent new stadium for the tournament, a monument to the occasion. and they carried the prestige of being the reigning Olympic champions, the best football nation in the world by the measure of the only international tournament that had existed until then. FIFA accepted. Uruguay would host the first World Cup. The trophy for the new tournament was commissioned by Rimet from the French sculptor Abel Lafleur. The result was a delicate, beautiful figurine of Nike, the Greek goddess of victory, rendered in gold, holding an octagonal cup above her head. It was 30 centimeters tall and weighed roughly 4 kilograms. Initially called simply the Victory Trophy, it would later be renamed the Jules Rimet Trophy in honor of the man who had made the tournament possible. For 40 years, that golden figure would change hands across 4 continents, become the object of theft and hiding and wartime drama, and finally pass permanently into the possession of the nation that won it 3 times first. The preparations were underway. A century of football's most extraordinary chapter was about to begin. Section 2. Uruguay, 1930, where it all began. The world in the summer of 1930 was not an easy place to cross. There were no commercial airlines. There were no transatlantic flights carrying passengers from Europe to South America in a matter of hours. If you wanted to get from Marseille or Genoa to Montevideo, you boarded a ship, and you settled in for approximately 2 weeks at sea, the Atlantic Ocean spreading enormous and unhurried beneath you, the southern hemisphere slowly drawing closer.
This was the journey that Jules Rimet himself made, departing on the 21st of June 1930, aboard an Italian passenger liner called the SS Conte Verde, accompanied by the national football teams of France, Romania, and Belgium. He carried the trophy in a small case. The teams from Brazil and other South American nations made their own separate crossings. Only 13 nations in total answered the invitation to participate in the first World Cup, a number that seems almost impossibly small compared to the 32 that would eventually contest the modern tournament. 7 came from South America, 4 from Europe, and 2 from North America, the United States and Mexico among them. The European response had been genuinely disappointing to Rimet. Many of the continent's stronger football nations, including England, Germany, Spain, and Italy, declined to make the journey. The reasons were a combination of practical and financial. Sending a team to South America meant 2 weeks of travel each way, plus the duration of the tournament itself, a commitment of 6 weeks or more at a time when the Great Depression was biting hard and when player contracts made such absences enormously complicated. It was only through Rimet's direct personal persuasion that France, his home country, agreed to send a team. Yugoslavia and Romania followed. Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, was a city of about 700,000 people in 1930, neat and confident, sitting on a wide bay where the River Plate opened out toward the Atlantic. The city had been preparing for months. Streets were tidied, hotels were organized, and at the edge of the city, on a broad, flat piece of land, the new stadium was being built. The Estadio Centenario, named for the centenary of Uruguay's first constitution, was a declaration of national pride rendered in concrete and steel. It had a capacity of around 90,000 spectators, an enormous figure for its time, and it was designed to dominate its surroundings, to announce that this occasion was important, was historic, was worth the effort of building something permanent. Jules Rimet himself called it the Temple of Football. It was not quite finished when the tournament began on the 13th of July 1930, and some early matches had to be played at two smaller venues in the city while workers completed the Centenario's upper tiers. But by the time the tournament reached its decisive stages, the great stadium was ready. The format of the first World Cup was simple by necessity. 13 teams were divided into 4 groups. 3 groups had 3 teams each, and 1 had 4. Each group played a round robin, with every team facing each other once. The winner of each group advanced to the semi-finals, and then came a final. There were no qualification rounds, no preliminary matches played months in advance in distant corners of the globe. This was simply a gathering, a meeting of nations, the first of its kind.
The opening matches were played on the 13th of July 1930. France faced Mexico and won 4-1. In that same match, a French player named Lucien Laurent scored in the 19th minute, placing a right-footed volley into the net after a cross from the left. It was a clean, assured finish, unremarkable in itself, but history would attach enormous significance to it. Lucien Laurent had scored the first goal ever recorded at a FIFA World Cup. He was 26 years old and had worked as a lathe operator before football. He would live to be 97, long enough to see his tiny piece of history grow into something legendary. The United States, somewhat surprisingly, proved to be one of the tournament's stronger teams. Their squad was composed largely of Scottish and English expatriates, professional players who had emigrated to the United States in the 1920s and qualified to represent their adopted country. They won their group comfortably, beating Belgium 3-0 and Paraguay 3-0 as well, and advanced to the semi-finals with ease. They were, for a brief moment, genuine World Cup contenders. Argentina were the clear favourites among the South American nations, boasting a dazzling fast-passing style and several exceptional individual players. They swept through their group and dispatched the United States 6-1 in the semi-finals, a result that rather clarified the limits of the American challenge. In the other semi-final, Uruguay beat Yugoslavia 6-1. The final would be a South American derby, a confrontation between the two greatest football nations of the Western Hemisphere.
The final was played on the 30th of July, 1930, before an announced crowd of 68,000, though estimates have suggested the true number might have been higher, with thousands pressing in against the fences and filling every available space. Uruguay and Argentina were neighbors across the River Plate, rivals in trade and culture, and now in football, and the match carried all the weight of that proximity, that competitive intimacy. Argentina took the lead through Carlos Pucel in the first half, and then Guillermo Stabile added a second shortly before half-time to give Argentina a 2-1 advantage. Uruguay had scored first through Pablo Dorado, but they went into the break a goal behind, facing the prospect of losing the first World Cup final on home soil before their own crowd in the centenary year of their independence. The pressure in that stadium in the second half must have been extraordinary. Uruguay came out differently in the second half. They equalized through Pedro Saya, then scored a third through Santos Iriarte to take the lead, and then with the game almost won, Hector Castro added a fourth, 4-2. Uruguay had come from behind to win the World Cup. The crowd erupted into something beyond ordinary celebration, a national roar of relief and joy and vindication. Jules Rimet presented the trophy to the head of the Uruguayan Football Association, a man named Raoul Jude, and the world's first football champions posed for photographs in the July evening light of Montevideo. In Buenos Aires, across the water, the reaction was considerably different.
Angry crowds gathered outside the Uruguayan consulate. The rivalry between these two neighbors, always fierce, had been given a new and lasting edge. Argentina would carry the memory of that defeat for decades.
But the World Cup had happened. It had been played, completed, decided. It had produced matches and stories and a champion. It was real now, not just a vision in the mind of a French football administrator aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. The tournament that Jules Rimet had dreamed of existed, and already it was impossible to imagine the world of football without it. Section 3. Italy 1934 and France 1938, the pre-war tournaments. The world of 1934 was considerably darker than the world of 1930. The Great Depression had deepened its grip. In Europe, political currents were running cold and dangerous. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany in January of 1933. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had been in power since 1922 and had established a fascist state that used spectacle and sport as instruments of national prestige. When Italy was awarded the right to host the Second World Cup in 1934, Mussolini understood immediately what was at stake, not just in football terms, but in propaganda terms. The 1934 World Cup was the first to require qualifying rounds. 32 nations entered the qualification process, with 16 eventual survivors earning the right to compete in the final tournament in Italy. This structure introduced another novelty and another irony. Uruguay, the defending champions, refused to participate. They were furious at the poor European attendance at the 1930 tournament, still stung by the fact that so many European nations had declined to make the journey to Montevideo. Their absence was a statement of wounded pride that would not be forgotten for years. The United States and Argentina returned, but the defending champions stayed home.
Italy, under Mussolini, prepared with extraordinary intensity. The national team was coached by Vittorio Pozzo, a meticulous, demanding man who had been managing the Italian national side since 1929. Pozzo was a tactical innovator and a fierce nationalist, and he built his team around a core of exceptional players, including Giuseppe Meazza, the elegant inside forward from Inter Milan, who was the most celebrated Italian footballer of his generation. Several players of Italian heritage who had been born or raised in South America were controversially recruited to strengthen the squad, a practice that attracted criticism but was technically within the rules. The tournament was played across 8 Italian cities, from Rome to Turin to Genoa. The format was a street knockout competition from the first round, which gave the whole affair an edge of immediate tension that the group stage of 1930 had somewhat softened. Every match was an elimination. Every mistake could be final. Italy played with the sort of fierce physical intensity that Pozzo demanded. They beat the United States 7-1 in their first match, an overwhelming statement of intent. They beat Spain in a brutal replay after the first match ended in a draw, a game in which 4 Spanish players were injured badly enough to miss the replay. They beat Austria in the semi-final and then faced Czechoslovakia in the final in Rome at the Stadio Nazionale del PNF, with Mussolini himself watching from the stands.
Czechoslovakia played beautiful football throughout the tournament and nearly caused an enormous upset. They took the lead in the final through Antonin Puig in the second half and looked for a time as though they might hold on. But Italy equalized through Raimundo Orsi with 8 minutes remaining, and then in extra time Angelo Schiavio scored the winner. Italy 2, Czechoslovakia 1. Mussolini was delighted. The propaganda value was maximized. Italy were world champions. 4 years later, in France in 1938, Vittorio Pozzo achieved something that nobody had managed before, and that only Germany would later come close to matching in the years that followed. He successfully defended Italy's World Cup title. It was an extraordinary achievement under any circumstances, but the circumstances of 1938 made it stranger still. Europe was by this point barely keeping its composure. Germany had annexed Austria in March of 1938, the Anschluss that merged the two countries and removed Austria's national football team from the tournament at a stroke. Several Austrian players were simply absorbed into the German squad. Spain was consumed by its civil war and withdrew from the competition. The geopolitical map of Europe was shifting in real time, and the World Cup was happening in the middle of it. France hosted in cities from Paris to Marseille to Bordeaux, and the tournament proceeded with a somewhat subdued atmosphere, given the gathering clouds of the continental crisis. Cuba made a memorable appearance, including a match in which they beat Romania, after initially drawing 1 goal each. The West Indies nation would not appear again at a World Cup for decades, and their run in 1938 remained one of the tournament's more charming footnotes.
Italy survived Hungary in the final by 4-2, Pozzo's tactical system proving its resilience one more time. Silvio Piola scored twice, and the great Meazza, now 30 years old and at the very end of his peak years, scored a penalty under pressure in the semi-final that remained one of his most celebrated moments. Italy were world champions for the second consecutive time. And then the world changed. Europe collapsed into the most catastrophic war in human history the following year, and the World Cup, along with so much else, fell into suspension. The Jules Rimet trophy had to be hidden during the occupation of Italy. An Italian football official named Ottorino Barassi secretly kept it in a shoebox under his bed throughout the war, unwilling to hand it over to the Nazi forces that swept through Italy after 1943. The trophy survived. The world had to be rebuilt before the tournament could return. There would be no World Cup in 1942. There would be no World Cup in 1946. The gap would be 12 years from 1938 to 1950, and when the tournament finally returned, it would return to a world that had changed in every conceivable way. Section 4. Brazil 1950. The Maracanazo. 12 years is a long time. Long enough for a generation of footballers who had been at their peak in 1938 to have aged entirely out of the game. Long enough for new nations to have discovered football and new generations of players to have grown up watching the game without ever watching a World Cup. When FIFA announced that the 1950 tournament would be held in Brazil, it felt like the beginning of something genuinely new, a fresh chapter after the horror and the silence of the war years.
Brazil sailed through their matches with extraordinary elan. They beat Mexico 4-0 and Yugoslavia 2-0 in the group stage. And then in the final group stage, they produced one of the tournament's greatest individual performances, beating Sweden 7-1 and Spain 6-1. The Brazilian crowd, enormous at every match, was rapturous. The newspapers were already composing their championship tributes. A celebratory song had been commissioned. There was, in the popular mind and in the media, essentially no question about what was going to happen in the final decisive game. Brazil needed only a draw against Uruguay in the last match of the final round-robin to win the World Cup. Uruguay, having managed only a draw and a win in their previous matches, needed to beat Brazil. On paper, this appeared not just difficult, but somewhere between extremely unlikely and essentially impossible. The Maracana on the day of that match held somewhere in the region of 200,000 people, the largest attendance ever recorded at a football match in history. A crowd so vast that it created its own weather system, its own atmospheric pressure, its own noise that could be heard kilometers away across the hills of Rio. Uruguay were not overawed. They had been here before, in some sense, in 1930, when they had beaten Argentina in front of another frenzied home crowd in Montevideo. They had a capacity for calm under the most intense pressure. Their coach, Juan Lopez, prepared his team carefully, and their captain, Obdulio Varela, a powerful, self-possessed midfielder, reportedly kept his team from reading the Brazilian newspapers in the days before the match, shielding them from the assumption of their own defeat. Brazil scored first. Friaca put the ball in the net in the 47th minute, shortly after half-time, and the Maracana erupted into a celebration that seemed already to be a coronation. The championship was 98 minutes away, and Brazil were ahead. The noise must have been overwhelming. But Uruguay kept playing. They kept their shape and their belief. Juan Alberto Schiaffino equalized in the 66th minute, and the Maracana went, by all accounts, eerily quiet. And then, 11 minutes from the end, Alcides Gigia, a slight, quick right winger, received the ball on his favoured side, cut inside, and drove a shot low into the near post corner past the Brazilian goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa. 2-1. Uruguay had scored twice in the final 20 minutes. Brazil needed a goal they could not find. The final whistle blew. Uruguay had won the World Cup. The silence that fell across the Maracana in those first moments after the final whistle has been described again and again by those who were present or who heard it described. A silence so total that it seemed physically impossible for 200,000 people to produce it. Men wept. Women fainted. Players sat on the pitch, unable to process what had happened. Jules Rimet, who had been preparing to hand the trophy to a Brazilian official, had to quietly approach the Uruguayan captain and hand it over with a brief, muted ceremony, entirely at odds with the grandeur that had been planned. The Maracanazo, the blow of the Maracana, became the defining wound of Brazilian football culture. The goalkeeper, Barbosa, unfairly blamed by much of the country for his inability to stop Gigia's shot, lived with that burden for the rest of his life. Brazilian players switched from white shirts to the blue and yellow kit we know today, partly as a psychological break from the uniform of that defeat. The playwright Nelson Rodrigues would later write that the loss was Brazil's Hiroshima, an outrageously hyperbolic comparison, and yet somehow indicative of the wound it left. Brazil would return, and return magnificently, but the Maracana of 1950 would never entirely leave them. Section 5. Switzerland 1954 and Sweden 1958. The rise of new powers. The 1954 World Cup in Switzerland was the first to be televised, at least in part, and the novelty of watching football through a screen for the first time gave the tournament an additional quality of wonder for European audiences. It was also the tournament of the Miracle of Bern, one of football's most astonishing upsets, and the tournament that finally revealed what Hungary's golden team was capable of, or rather, revealed it and then immediately snatched it away. Hungary in the early 1950s were quite simply the best football team in the world. Under their coach, Gustav Szebes, they had developed a system of fluid, interchanging positions and relentless attacking movement that was years ahead of anything else being played at the highest level. Their captain and talisman was Ferenc Puskás, a stocky, barrel-chested, left-footed genius who scored goals with a regularity and ease that seemed almost impossible. Between June 1950 and February 1956, Hungary went unbeaten in 50 consecutive international matches. They beat England 6-3 at Wembley in November 1953, England's first ever home defeat against a non-British opponent, a result so shocking that English football spent the rest of the decade trying to process what it meant. At the 1954 World Cup, Hungary arrived in Switzerland as overwhelming favourites. In the group stage, they beat West Germany 8-3, a result that seemed to confirm everything about their superiority. West Germany, recently readmitted to FIFA and making their first World Cup appearance since the war, appeared to be outclassed in every department. But in the final, something strange happened. The game was played in Bern, in the Wankdorf Stadion, in the rain. Hungary scored twice in the first 8 minutes, and it seemed the game was already decided. Then West Germany scored twice to level. Then Hungary pushed for the winner and could not find it. And with 6 minutes remaining, a West German forward named Helmut Rahn drove the ball through a crowded penalty area and into the Hungarian net. 3-2, West Germany had beaten Hungary. Puskás had a goal ruled out for offside in the final minutes, a decision that remains controversial to this day, but the game was over. West Germany were world champions.
The miracle of Bern was a moment of enormous psychological significance for West Germany, a country still under occupation, still rebuilding from the devastation of the war, still carrying the weight of its recent history. The World Cup triumph was framed immediately as a statement of national rebirth, a moment that gave a shattered country something to feel proud of again. The journalist and author Joachim Fest later described it as the founding moment of the Federal Republic's national identity. Hungary were crushed. They would never reach that peak again. The following year, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution was brutally suppressed by Soviet forces, and many Hungarian players fled the country into exile. The Golden Team scattered. Puskás ended up in Spain, eventually naturalizing and representing the Spanish national team. A generation of remarkable talent was dispersed across the football world, contributing enormously to the clubs that received them, but leaving the Hungarian national team hollowed out. 4 years later, in Sweden in 1958, the World Cup produced one of the most startling individual arrivals the tournament has ever witnessed. His name was Pele. He was 17 years old. Edson Arantes do Nascimento, who had gone by the nickname Pele since childhood for reasons that remain somewhat unclear even to him, had grown up in poverty in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, the son of a footballer himself. He had been identified as exceptional talent at Santos, the club where he spent most of his career, and had been selected for the Brazilian national squad for the 1958 World Cup, despite being the youngest player ever to represent the country at that point.
Brazil came to Sweden carrying the memory of 1950 and carrying a new style of play that would come to define them for generations. Their system, built around a 4-2-4 formation, was innovative and attacking, and it sat perfectly around the individual gifts of players like Garrincha, the winger with bowed legs whose changes of direction at speed seemed physically impossible, Didi, the elegant deep-lying playmaker, and the teenage Pelé, who came into the tournament having missed the early group matches with a knee injury, and then exploded into the knockout rounds with a force that seemed entirely disproportionate to his age.
In the quarter-final against Wales, Pelé scored the only goal of the match, a close control, turn and finish in the penalty area that is on film already recognisably the work of something special. In the semi-final against France, he scored a hat-trick. And in the final against the host nation Sweden, he scored twice more, including a thunderous volley that beat two defenders and the goalkeeper and sent the ball into the net with an authority that left the Swedish crowd applauding despite themselves. Brazil won the final 5-2. Pelé, 17 years old, wept on the shoulder of the veteran goalkeeper Gilmar at the final whistle. Brazil had their first World Cup, and the world had its first glimpse of the player who would come to define the tournament for an entire generation. Section 6, Chile 1962 and England 1966. Grit, glory, and the question of a goal.
The 1962 World Cup in Chile was in some ways a tournament that promised more than it delivered, at least in terms of sheer brilliance. The defending champions Brazil returned, and Pele returned with them, but a muscle injury in the second group game ended his participation for the rest of the tournament. Brazil nevertheless found a way to win, largely through the extraordinary talent of Garrincha, who was arguably at the peak of his powers in Chile, and whose performances in the knockout rounds were among the most electrifying in World Cup history. The tournament is perhaps better remembered for the Battle of Santiago, a match in the group stage between Chile and Italy that descended into genuine violence. 2 Italian players were sent off, a Chilean player was punched by an Italian, another was kicked. The English referee Ken Aston struggled to maintain anything resembling control. The match, which Chile won 2-0, was so bad that the BBC commentator David Coleman introduced the broadcast of highlights in Britain by warning viewers that what they were about to see was the most unpleasant football match ever televised. The Battle of Santiago became a byword for the sport at its worst. Brazil beat Czechoslovakia 3-1 in the final and became the first country to successfully defend the World Cup title, a feat that would not be repeated until France attempted it 36 years later. Garrincha, technically co-sharing the Golden Boot award for top scorer, was the tournament's defining presence, even if the final itself was not particularly memorable.
4 years later, in England in 1966, the World Cup came home to the country where the game had been invented. The tournament was held in the summer across multiple English cities, including London, Manchester, Birmingham, and Middlesbrough, and it produced what remains one of the most discussed goals in football history, a goal that some people say crossed the line and others say never did, and which became known simply as the Wembley goal. England were managed by Alf Ramsey, a former fullback and deeply methodical tactician who had told the English press and public after his appointment in 1963 that England would win the 1966 World Cup. It was the sort of statement that could easily end a managerial career, but Ramsey built his team with care and conviction, constructing a system of 2 hard-working wingerless midfielders who provided the platform for his forwards to operate. The attacking heart of his system was a compact, powerful, supremely intelligent combination of Bobby Charlton, the driving midfielder from Manchester United, and Geoff Hurst, the West Ham striker. Germany, Portugal with the magnificent Eusebio, and the Soviet Union were all strong contenders. North Korea, entirely unknown and expected by almost everyone to be eliminated immediately, caused one of the great upsets of the tournament, beating Italy 1-0 in the group stage and sending the Italians home to a reception of eggs and tomatoes thrown by furious fans of the airport. North Korea then led Portugal 3-0 in the quarter-final before Eusebio, one of the most gifted players of his era, essentially won the match by himself, scoring 4 goals in a 5-3 comeback victory. The final at Wembley on the 30th of July. 1966, between England and West Germany, was the most watched sporting event in British television history to that point. The game was level at 2 goals each, with only minutes remaining, when Geoff Hurst's shot from the edge of the penalty area struck the underside of the crossbar, bounced down onto the goal line, and was awarded as a goal by the linesman Tofik Bahramov of the Soviet Union, who alone among the officials appeared to see the ball clearly cross the line. West Germany protested vigorously. England celebrated. The goal stood. England scored a 4th in injury time, Geoff Hurst completing a hat-trick by driving the ball into the net with such force that the ball flew almost back out again, and Kenneth Wolstenholme delivered his immortal commentary line, noting that some people are on the pitch that they think it is all over, and then as the ball hit the net, simply, "It is now." England were world champions. The Wembley goal remains debated to this day, its legitimacy periodically tested by new photographic and computer analysis. The technology is still inconclusive. Some questions, it seems, are meant to endure. Section 7. Mexico 1970, the greatest World Cup ever played.
There are things about the 1970 World Cup in Mexico that exist in their own category of footballing memory. Things that are discussed not merely as sporting history, but almost as mythology, as if the tournament took place at a slightly elevated altitude, not just geographically, but spiritually. As if, for those few weeks in June, the game briefly became something more than a game. The altitude was real enough. Many of the Mexican cities hosting matches sat over 2,000 meters above sea level, which meant the air was thin and beautiful, and the ball flew differently, and players had to manage their oxygen more carefully than they had ever been asked to before. Brazil arrived in Mexico as the tournament's most anticipated presence. Their squad was, even by Brazilian standards, extraordinary. Pelé was 30 years old and at the absolute apex of his powers. Carlos Alberto Torres was their imperious captain and right-back. Clodoaldo, Rivellino, Tostão, Gerson, Jairzinho. The names read like a poem. Jairzinho, the powerful right-winger, would become the only player in World Cup history to score in every single match of a tournament. The manager, Mario Zagallo, himself a double World Cup winner as a player in 1958 and 1962, built around these talents a team of such flowing intelligence and creativity that observers ran out of adequate language to describe them. Words like beautiful and joyful and transcendent appeared in the football writing of the time with a frequency that might seem excessive if the football had not apparently warranted it. In their opening match, Brazil beat Czechoslovakia 4-1, and Pelé almost scored one of the most audacious goals imaginable, attempting a shot from roughly the halfway line after seeing the Czech goalkeeper off his line, a shot that very nearly went in and that the goalkeeper fumbled before recovering. The image of Pelé watching the ball drift narrowly wide, his face a complex portrait of acceptance and residual wonder, was one of the first images of the tournament that suggested something different was happening here. Against England in the group stage, in the heat of Guadalajara, Pelé produced what he later described as one of the most satisfying experiences of his career, though not in the way one might expect. In the first half, with the game still scoreless, Jairzinho cut from the right, crossed, and Pelé met the ball with a powerful downward header aimed perfectly for the bottom right corner of the England goal.
The England goalkeeper, Gordon Banks, positioned centrally, scrambled low to his right and somehow, impossibly, scooped the ball up and over the bar. Pele had already begun to raise his arms in celebration before he registered that the ball had not gone in. He stood there, genuinely astonished, and said afterwards that he had asked God, how did he save that? The save is still regularly voted the greatest ever made in the history of football. It deserves that reputation. Brazil won 1-0. At the final whistle, Pele and the England captain Bobby Moore exchanged shirts and then embraced warmly. Two extraordinary players paying one another the tribute of genuine mutual respect. A moment of grace that the photographs capture perfectly. In the semi-final, a match took place that had nothing to do with Brazil, but that nonetheless earned the title the Game of the Century. Italy against West Germany. Italy had been 1 goal up for most of the match, playing their characteristic disciplined defensive football, and appeared to be on their way to the final, when Germany equalized in the final seconds of normal time. Then extra time produced 5 more goals, the match swinging back and forth with a breathless, almost hysterical quality. Italy finally winning 4-3. Karl-Heinz Schnellinger scored for Germany, Rivera scored for Italy, Müller scored for Germany, Riva scored for Italy, Rivera scored the winner for Italy. Players were collapsing from exhaustion. The goalkeepers had faced more shots than their bodies could comfortably absorb. It was the kind of match that left everyone who witnessed it slightly changed. The final between Brazil and Italy was expected to be a contest between two great traditions, Brazil's attacking brilliance against Italy's defensive solidity. What happened was something beyond expectation. Brazil's 4th goal, scored with 14 minutes remaining and making the score 4-1, is widely regarded as the finest team goal ever scored in a World Cup final. The move began when Brazil won possession deep in their own half. It passed through 7 players, each touch accurate and purposeful, moving the ball with accelerating speed and precision up the field, until the captain Carlos Alberto arrived at pace onto a perfectly weighted pass from Pelé and struck the ball into the corner of the Italian net with a force and certainty that seemed to sum up everything about that team. Carlos Alberto's goal, the goal of the tournament, perhaps the goal of the era.
Brazil, 3 stars. They were the first nation to win the World Cup 3 times, and under the rules of the competition, 3 victories meant permanent possession of the Jules Rimet trophy. The golden figurine that had traveled on a ship from Europe to South America 40 years earlier was now Brazil's forever. They took it back to Rio, where it was eventually stolen in 1983 and never recovered, melted down and lost to history. But that is a sadness for later. In the summer of 1970, in the thin, glittering air of Mexico, Brazil were perfect. Section 8. West Germany 1974 and Argentina 1978. Total football and dark shadows. The 1974 World Cup in West Germany introduced the watching world to an idea, a philosophy, a way of playing football that would influence the game for the next 50 years and that still echoes in the tactical conversations of every significant football nation. It was called total football, and it came from the Netherlands. The Dutch national team of the early 1970s had been shaped primarily by the ideas of a small, intense, fiercely intelligent coach named Rinus Michels, and his collaboration with one of the most singular footballing minds of the 20th century, Johan Cruyff. Cruyff was a forward in the most technical sense, a player who wore the number 14 shirt because Dutch clubs had begun numbering by position.
but he was in reality something harder to categorize. A conductor, an architect, a player whose intelligence about space and movement and the geometry of the game seemed to operate several seconds ahead of everyone else on the pitch.
Total football, as Michels and Cruyff practiced it at Ajax and with the Dutch national team, was built on the idea that every player on the field should be capable of playing in every position, that the shape of a team should be fluid and responsive rather than fixed and rigid, that space itself was the commodity being competed for, and that the intelligent use and denial of space was the true language of the highest level of the game. When a Dutch defender moved forward, another player would drop into cover. When a forward tracked back, a midfielder would push up. The team breathed as a single organism. It was radical and it was beautiful. The Netherlands arrived at the 1974 World Cup in West Germany, having lost Johan Cruyff for almost the entire qualification campaign due to injury, and having only recently re-established themselves as a footballing power at the international level. They were brilliant throughout the tournament. They beat Uruguay, Argentina, Bulgaria and East Germany in the group stages, then swept past Argentina and East Germany in the second round, playing football that genuinely dazzled. Cruyff was magnificent, creative, decisive, constantly moving, constantly demanding, constantly threatening. Rob Rensenbrink, Johnny Rep, Ruud Krol, Wim Serbia. The squad was deep and technically excellent. Their semi-final victory over the defending champions Brazil was a statement of comprehensive superiority. The final against West Germany in Munich should have been the moment everything came together. Instead, it produced one of the great what-ifs of World Cup history. The Netherlands scored within the first 2 minutes before a German player had even touched the ball. Neeskens converting a penalty after Cruyff was brought down in the box, a goal of almost theatrical perfection. And then, inexplicably, they stopped pressing. They dropped their tempo. They played a kind of showboating football that may have been intended as dominance, but left gaps. And West Germany, a solid, experienced, extremely well-organized team built around Franz Beckenbauer, the sweeper who played like a midfielder, and the striker Gerd Müller, who had a gift for finishing from close quarters that was almost supernatural in its efficiency, took those gaps. West Germany equalized through Paul Breitner, and then Müller scored the winner in the second half with a turn and finish of such sharp, instinctive quality that it was almost the perfect embodiment of German pragmatism against Dutch aesthetics. West Germany 2, Netherlands 1. Total football had come to the World Cup and been the best thing in it, and had still lost the final. It remains one of sport's most discussed injustices, though West Germany were far from undeserving. Argentina 1978 was a different kind of tournament, one whose history sits uncomfortably even now. Argentina was at that time ruled by a military junta that had come to power through a coup in 1976, and that was, during the period of the World Cup, systematically torturing, imprisoning, and murdering thousands of its political opponents in a campaign of state terror that would later be counted among the worst human rights catastrophes in South American history. The tournament was used by the junta as an explicit propaganda exercise, a showcase of national normalcy and pride, designed partly for domestic consumption and partly for the watching world. Johan Cruyff did not come. He had cited personal security concerns following a kidnapping attempt on his family in Barcelona, though years later he acknowledged the moral dimension of his absence as well. Several other players and commentators questioned whether a major sporting event should be held under such a regime.
FIFA proceeded regardless, and Argentina hosted.
Argentina as a team were led by a charismatic coach named Cesar Luis Menotti, who was himself a leftist opposed to the junta, and who created a somewhat surreal situation where the national team was both the junta's showpiece and privately managed by someone with no sympathy for the government. Mario Kempes, the striker who played for Valencia in Spain, was the tournament's top scorer and most devastating attacker, quick, strong, and technically assured. Argentina's path to the final included a highly controversial match against Peru, in which they needed to win by 4 goals to advance. They won 6-0, and allegations that the result was arranged have circulated ever since, with a Peruvian goalkeeper of Argentine origin between the posts, and rumors of political and economic pressure applied to the Peruvian government never entirely dismissed. The final against the Netherlands was hard-fought and dramatic. Argentina won 3-1 after extra time, Kempes scoring twice in a performance of individual brilliance. The ticker tape that fell from the stands in Buenos Aires, the crowds that gathered outside the stadium, the images of celebration that went around the world, all of this served the junta's purposes exactly. The World Cup had given them their showcase. What lay beneath it remained mostly hidden from the watching world at the time. Section 9. Spain 1982 and Mexico 1986. Marvels and the Hand of God.
The 1982 World Cup in Spain expanded the tournament to 24 teams for the first time, a change that brought new nations to the stage and increased the sense of the World Cup as a genuinely global event rather than merely a European and South American competition. Cameroon made their debut and drew all 3 of their group matches without losing any, the first African side to make any kind of impression on the tournament. New Zealand appeared, Kuwait appeared, Honduras appeared. The world was getting bigger. The Spanish edition also produced what many football historians consider the greatest team never to win the World Cup. Brazil's 1982 squad, managed by Tele Santana, played a brand of attacking, creative, technically brilliant football that was described almost universally at the time as the most beautiful in the world. Zico, Socrates, Falcao, Cerezo, Ada, Jr. The midfield alone contained 4 players capable of being considered among the best in the world. They attacked with abandon and they defended barely at all, operating on a fundamental philosophy that stated that if we score enough goals, it does not matter how many we concede. Against the Soviet Union in the group stage, they won 4-1 in a performance of such sustained excellence that even the Soviet players appeared to be watching in admiration.
They met Italy in the second group stage. Italy had been poor throughout the tournament, scraping into the knockout rounds with 3 consecutive draws, and their striker, Paolo Rossi, had returned from a 2-year ban for his involvement in a match-fixing scandal and had not scored a single goal in the competition. Against Brazil, he scored a hat-trick, 3 goals. Italy won 3-2 in a match of such extraordinary lung-bursting drama that it has been called by football writers the greatest match of all time with some regularity. Brazil, needing only a draw to advance, pushed forward relentlessly and conceded 3 times to a striker who had seemed completely out of form. Italy went on to win the tournament, beating West Germany 3-1 in the final, and Paolo Rossi finished as the tournament's top scorer and won the Golden Ball award. Brazil went home, their beautiful football producing nothing,
and the football world mourned a little. The 1986 World Cup came to Mexico 4 years later, after Colombia, the original host nation, had to withdraw. Mexico stepped in late, already having hosted the tournament in 1970, and managed it with admirable organization, despite an earthquake of devastating power having struck the country just months before the tournament. The Mexican people had lost thousands of their fellow citizens to the disaster. They hosted a World Cup regardless. Mexico 1986 belonged to one man. His name was Diego Armando Maradona, and the tournament he produced stands as perhaps the most singular individual performance in the history of the competition. Maradona was 25 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a low center of gravity, extraordinary close control, and a speed of thought and foot that simply overwhelmed defenders. He played for Napoli in Italy and was acknowledged by virtually everyone as the best player in the world. He came to Mexico carrying the additional psychological weight of Argentina's defeat in 1982, when he had been sent off in a bad-tempered loss to Brazil, and carrying the particular edge of an Argentine man whose country had fought a war against England only 4 years earlier in the Falklands. The quarter-final between Argentina and England in the Estadio Azteca in Mexico City on the 22nd of June 1986 contained in the space of 4 minutes the 2 most discussed goals in World Cup history, one the most controversial, one the most celebrated. First came the handball. A misguided back header from the English defender Steve Hodge floated towards the Argentine penalty area, and Maradona rose alongside the England goalkeeper Peter Shilton to contest it. The ball reached Maradona's left hand before it reached his head, but the Hungarian referee Ali bin Nasser, positioned poorly, saw only what appeared to be a header and awarded the goal. Maradona, immediately upon scoring, turned and ran towards the corner flag without looking at the referee, his teammates pursuing him, knowing perfectly well what had happened. When asked about it afterwards, he described the goal as having been scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The phrase entered the language. Shilton protested for decades.
Then came the other one. 4 minutes after the handball, Maradona received the ball in his own half near the midfield line and turned into space. He ran at the England defence. He beat one player, then another. He changed direction. He beat a third. He dummied past a fourth. He rounded the goalkeeper and walked the ball into the net. He had covered approximately 60 meters at full speed, changing direction multiple times, beating 6 separate defenders, and finishing with absolute composure. The Argentine commentator Victor Hugo Morales, speaking live on radio, delivered a description of the goal so rhapsodic that it has been replayed thousands of times in the years since, culminating in his declaration that it was something from another planet, a cosmic kite, barrilete cosmico. FIFA voters later named it the goal of the century. The debate about its worthiness for that title is extremely brief. Argentina won 2-1 and went on to beat West Germany 3-2 in the final. Maradona lifted the trophy, tears streaming. Section 10. Italy 1990 and USA 1994. Tears, penalties, and the beautiful game's difficult chapter. The 1990 World Cup in Italy was, by most measures, the most defensively organised, lowest scoring and tactically cautious World Cup ever staged. The average number of goals per match dropped to 2.21, the lowest on record to that point.
Many teams came with the primary intention of not losing rather than winning, and the result was a tournament of extraordinary drama at the margins, in the penalty shootouts and the final minutes, but not always a great deal of joy in the actual football.
Italy staged it beautifully. The stadiums were magnificent, the San Siro and the Olimpico, and the Napoli ground, where Maradona was simultaneously a hometown hero given his years at the club, and the opposition captain in the semi-final against Italy. That semi-final, played in Naples, produced one of the tournament's most peculiar atmospheres, a stadium divided between Italian nationals and Neapolitans who had grown up watching Maradona play for their club and could not entirely bring themselves to boo him. Argentina won on penalties. The crowd in Naples was ambivalent. Italy were out. The player who defined the tournament's emotional register was Paul Gascoigne of England, a supremely gifted, deeply erratic, magnificently talented young midfielder who wept in the semi-final against West Germany after receiving a yellow card that would have suspended him for the final had England reached it. The image of Gazza's tears, the lower lip trembling, the eyes filling, the face crumpling in a way that seemed entirely unguarded and entirely genuine, became the defining image of the tournament for the English-speaking world. England lost on penalties. West Germany beat Argentina in a bad-tempered, largely dreadful final through a penalty awarded in the dying minutes, and the tournament ended without the high note it had been promising. Cameroon were the tournament's true revelation, led by the 38-year-old striker Roger Milla, who emerged from partial retirement to become the tournament's most joyful presence. Cameroon beat Argentina in the opening match, qualified from the group and reached the quarter-finals before losing to England after taking the lead twice. Miller celebrated his goals with a dance around the corner flag that became one of the tournament's warmest memories. Sub-Saharan Africa had arrived at the World Cup in the most emphatic possible fashion. The 1994 World Cup in the United States was something of an experiment, taking the world's most popular sport to the one major country that had not traditionally embraced it, packing enormous stadiums with crowds that were large, enthusiastic, and by the standards of Brazilian or Italian football culture, relatively quiet. The format was adjusted to award 3 points for a win rather than 2 in the group stage, an attempt to incentivize attacking football after 1990's defensive tournament. It was the first World Cup that had to be decided without the Jules Rimet trophy, which had been permanently stolen from the Brazilian Football Federation's Rio office in 1983 and never recovered. The current FIFA World Cup trophy, designed by the Italian sculptor Silvio Gazzaniga and first presented to the winners in 1974, was what was at stake in Pasadena on the 17th of July 1994, when Brazil and Italy faced one another in the first World Cup final ever to be decided without a single goal in either normal time or extra time.
Brazil and Italy played 120 goalless minutes of careful, searching, mutually respectful football, neither able to break the other down, neither willing to take the risks that might lead to defeat. The match went to penalties. Italy's great striker, Roberto Baggio, arguably the finest Italian footballer of his generation, a player of extraordinary technical refinement and genuine spiritual depth who held the Buddhist faith, stepped up to take the final kick, needing to score to keep Italy in the competition. He struck the ball over the crossbar. He stood for a moment, head bowed, hands on hips, in a posture that photographers captured from every angle. The image of Baggio's missed penalty became, like Gazza's tears 4 years earlier, the defining image of a tournament. Brazil were world champions for the 4th time.
Baggio carried the miss with great dignity for the rest of his life. Section 11. France 1998 and South Korea and Japan 2002. Upsets, a golden generation, and the Samba Boys return. The 1998 World Cup in France expanded the tournament further to 32 teams, the format it has maintained until the present day. France hosted beautifully and used the occasion to introduce a golden generation of their own, a squad built around the principle that the most cosmopolitan country in Western Europe could draw on a diverse range of talent from across its African diaspora and produce something truly special. Zinedine Zidane, born in Marseille to Algerian parents, was the creative heart of the team. Emmanuel Petit, Marcel Desailly, Lilian Thuram, Patrick Vieira. The squad had extraordinary depth.
But the tournament's most discussed subplot involved not France, but Brazil, and specifically their star player, Ronaldo. Known to distinguish him from other Ronaldos as the original, or simply the phenomenon, Ronaldo Luiz Nazario de Lima was the most physically extraordinary striker of his generation, a player combining pace, power and technical ability in a package that defenders struggled to cope with. He was 21 years old in 1998 and arguably the most famous footballer on earth. On the night of the final, held on the 12th of July at the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, Ronaldo appeared on the Brazilian team sheet and then was removed from it and then reinstated, a sequence of events that generated enormous confusion and concern. Brazil played well below their level. Zidane scored twice in the first half with headed goals from corners, and France eventually won 3-0. Afterwards, reports emerged that Ronaldo had suffered some kind of convulsive episode in the hours before the match, and that his inclusion in the starting lineup had been controversial internally within the Brazilian squad. The precise medical facts were unclear for years. What was clear was that Brazil had been poor, Ronaldo had been a shadow of himself, and France had won on home soil, in front of a country that had seemed almost surprised by how much they cared about football until they discovered they cared about it enormously.
The 2002 World Cup, held jointly for the first time across two countries, South Korea and Japan, was the tournament of upsets. Senegal, appearing at their first ever World Cup, beat the defending champions France 1-0 in the opening match, one of the competition's greatest opening day shocks. France, missing Zidane with an injury for most of the tournament, failed to score a single goal and went out in the group stage. Argentina, one of the favourites, also failed to get out of the group. South Korea, the co-hosts, produced one of the tournament's most improbable and contentious runs. Managed by the Dutch coach Guus Hiddink, who had transformed their tactical organisation and fitness in the years before the tournament, South Korea beat Spain on penalties in the quarter-finals and Turkey in the semi-finals, becoming the first Asian nation ever to reach the last four of a World Cup. Their journey was celebrated across the country with scenes of collective joy that were genuinely extraordinary to witness. Millions of fans gathering in city centres draped in red to watch screens together. Critics suggested that some of the refereeing decisions in South Korea's matches had been favourable to the hosts in ways that strained credibility. The Korean players and management maintained that they had simply worked harder and believed more completely than anyone expected. Ronaldo's redemption was the tournament's headline story. He returned from his mysterious illness of 1998 and his subsequent serious knee injuries that had kept him out of the game for extended periods and that had led some observers to wonder if he would ever fully recover, and he was simply magnificent.
He scored 8 goals in 7 matches, including twice in the final against Germany, securing Brazil's 5th World Cup title and finishing as the tournament's top scorer. He celebrated each goal with a wide, unrestrained smile that carried the weight of everything he had been through, the convulsive episode in Paris, the years of surgery and rehabilitation, the doubt. He had come back. Brazil had come back. The phenomenon had found his story's proper ending. Section 12. Germany 2006 and South Africa 2010, the headbutt and the vuvuzelas. The 2006 World Cup in Germany was a tournament of high-quality football and superb organisation that will, for many people, be permanently overshadowed by 11 seconds of madness in its final match. Those 11 seconds involved Zinedine Zidane, who had come out of international retirement to lead France's ageing but still formidable squad, and the Italian defender Marco Materazzi, and a headbutt that became the most watched piece of footage from the tournament. The context matters. France had not expected to reach the final. Their squad was old by international standards, several of the key players from 1998 still present, but now in their early to mid-30s. Zidane himself was 34 years old and had announced before the tournament that it would be his last. He played beautifully throughout, scoring a celebrated penalty chip in the final that was one of the most audacious competitive kicks ever attempted, striking the ball so that it hit the underside of the crossbar and bounced down just over the line before the goalkeeper could recover. Italy equalised through Materazzi. With the game still level in extra time, Zidane and Materazzi had a brief verbal exchange. Whatever was said, Materazzi said it twice, and the second time Zidane turned and drove his forehead into the Italian's chest, knocking him to the ground. The red card was issued. Zidane walked off the pitch, past the World Cup trophy, without looking at it, his tournament and his international career ending in disqualification rather than the coronation it had been building toward. Italy won the penalty shootout. Zidane's extraordinary career was over. For days and weeks afterwards, the world spoke of almost nothing else, analysing the footage, attempting to lip-read Materazzi's words, debating what Zidane had heard that could have prompted such a response from a man of such evident personal dignity. Italy deserved their win. Their defensive organisation had been exceptional throughout the tournament, and Cannavaro, their captain and centre-back, played at such a consistently commanding level that he won the Ballon d'Or at the end of the year, the last defender to do so. Italy were worthy champions. The headbutt simply made it impossible to talk about anything else. 4 years later, in South Africa, the World Cup came to the African continent for the first time. The 2010 tournament in South Africa was an event of enormous symbolic importance. The first time the world's biggest sporting competition had been held on the continent that houses a quarter of the global population, that had so often been host rather than participant in the World Cup story. South Africa prepared with passionate determination and hosted with a warmth and a volume that was quite different from anything the tournament had experienced before. The volume was literal. The vuvuzela, a single-note plastic horn that South African football fans had been using at domestic matches for years, became the sonic signature of the tournament. A continuous wall of noise that saturated every broadcast and confused supporters around the world who initially wondered if their television sets had a persistent bee problem. The vuvuzela divided opinion, celebrated by some as authentic expression of local football culture and criticized by others as an instrument of genuine acoustic suffering. But it became iconic in the way that only truly distinctive things become iconic, a sound that triggers an immediate and specific memory in everyone who watched the 2010 World Cup. Spain won the tournament, their first World Cup title, and did so in a manner entirely consistent with the style that had made them the best team in Europe for several years. Built around the Barcelona core of Xavi, Iniesta and Busquets, and supplemented by the Real Madrid and Liverpool talent of Sergio Ramos and Fernando Torres, Spain played a positional, possession-based style called tiki-taka that required opponents to chase a ball they never quite seemed to catch. They beat Germany in the semi-final and the Netherlands in the final through a single goal, Andres Iniesta's strike in extra time, his celebration stripping his shirt to reveal the name of a recently deceased teammate and friend, a moment of grief and joy occurring simultaneously. A German psychic octopus named Paul, kept in a tank at the Sea Life Centre in Oberhausen, correctly predicted the outcome of all 8 of Germany's matches in the tournament, including their defeats, by choosing one of 2 boxes representing the 2 teams. His accuracy attracted international media attention, and he became, briefly, the most famous cephalopod in history. He died in October 2010. He had accurately predicted a World Cup champion. The world mourned. Section 13. Brazil 2014 and Russia 2018. The Mineirazo and French Renaissance. The 2014 World Cup returned to Brazil for the first time since 1950, and the parallels were not lost on anyone. Brazil again hosted, Brazil again began as one of the favourites, and Brazil again had a catastrophic encounter with a European nation in the late stages of the tournament that entered the collective memory under a name combining the stadium and the concept of defeat. The stadium was the Estadio Mineirão in Belo Horizonte. The event was the Mineirazo.
But first, the tournament itself, which produced extraordinary football across dozens of matches, and which is remembered, among other things, for James Rodriguez of Colombia, who, at 23 years old, produced a campaign of such consistent brilliance that his goal against Uruguay, a chest control and left-footed volley from outside the penalty area that finished in the top corner, was voted the goal of the tournament by an overwhelming margin. Colombia reached the quarter-finals before losing to Brazil. Rodriguez was the tournament's top scorer. His impact on the shirt sales of his club Real Madrid, which he joined shortly after, was immediate and enormous. Brazil progressed through the tournament with a mixture of results that suggested a team relying heavily on the brilliance of Neymar, their star forward, and on the fortunate timing of specific moments. They beat Chile on penalties after a goalless extra time. They beat Colombia by 2-1 in a quarter-final that was notably physical, Neymar being carried from the pitch with a fractured vertebra after a knee to the back from a Colombian defender, an injury that would rule him out for the rest of the tournament.
Germany met Brazil in the semi-final on the 8th of July 2014 at the Mineirazo, and what followed has been described in any number of ways, none of them adequate to the strangeness of what actually happened. Brazil, playing without Neymar and without their suspended captain David Luiz, were not expected to win easily, but nobody expected what Germany actually did. The match lasted 90 minutes. Germany scored 5 goals in the first 29 of those minutes. Müller in the 11th minute, Klose in the 23rd, his second goal of the tournament making him the all-time top scorer in World Cup history with 16 goals. Kroos in the 24th and 26th minutes, Khedira in the 29th. 5 goals in 18 minutes against Brazil in Brazil. The crowd of 60,000 Brazilians sat in silence so complete that television broadcasts could clearly pick up individual voices speaking in the stands. Some people were weeping, some were waving white handkerchiefs, some simply stared. Germany eventually won 7-1. The Brazilian television journalist, who had to describe the score in real time as the goals went in, used a tone of voice that will remain one of the saddest sounds in sports broadcasting. Germany beat Argentina in the final 1-0. Mario Gazza settling the match in extra time with a chest control and left-footed finish of considerable quality. Argentina's Messi was the tournament's best player award winner. He did not look particularly happy about it.
Russia 2018 produced a tournament of surprises that accumulated into an atmosphere of sustained delight for neutrals. Argentina, Portugal and Germany, 3 of the tournament's most fancied sides, all departed earlier than expected. Germany went home in the group stage, their World Cup defending performance among the most shocking collapses in recent football history. Argentina barely survived the group stage before Messi finally began to look like himself and carried them past Nigeria, and then France eliminated them in the last 16 in a match of fine open football. France were the ultimate winners, a young squad assembled with a vision of diversity and technical quality that recalled the 1998 squad. Kylian Mbappé, 18 years old and of Cameroonian and Algerian heritage, became the second teenager in World Cup history to score in a final, the first since Pele in 1958. Griezmann, Varane, Pogba, Kanté. France beat Croatia 4-2 in a final played in Moscow in the rain. A game that included a goalkeeper error, a penalty, a beautiful goal, and considerable physical effort from the Croatian players, who had spent the first week of the knockout rounds in extra time and had been put through the physical ringer. Luka Modric, Croatia's 32-year-old captain and creative heart, won the Golden Ball as the tournament's best player, becoming the first man other than Messi or Ronaldo to win the award in a decade. Croatia were worthy finalists who deserved better than to lose to the better team. Section 14. Qatar 2022 and the legacy of the World Cup.
The 2022 World Cup in Qatar was, before it began, the most controversial in the history of the competition. The decision by FIFA to award the tournament to Qatar, a small Gulf state of roughly 3 million people, had been made in December 2010, alongside the simultaneous decision to give the 2018 tournament to Russia, in a vote that subsequently attracted years of investigation, allegations of bribery and corruption, and revelations about the internal workings of FIFA that shocked many but surprised relatively few. Qatar, a nation where temperatures in summer routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius, where football was not a significant cultural presence, and where the legal status of migrant workers who would build the tournament's infrastructure raised profound human rights concerns, was not an obvious host. The construction of Qatar's 8 World Cup stadiums, along with the transportation infrastructure, hotels and facilities that the tournament required, relied enormously on migrant labor from South Asia, particularly Nepal, Bangladesh, India and Pakistan. Reports by human rights organizations, journalists and investigating bodies documented disturbing conditions for workers in the construction sector, including the kafala sponsorship system that restricted workers' ability to change employers or leave the country without permission, and credible estimates of worker deaths numbered in the thousands across the decade of construction, though precise figures remain disputed. FIFA's response to these concerns was widely criticized as inadequate. The tournament proceeded.
To make the matches playable in tolerable temperatures, the entire event was moved from the traditional summer window to November and December, cutting through the European club football season and creating enormous logistical complications for clubs whose players would miss months of competitive football. The stadiums were air-conditioned, a technological achievement that was simultaneously impressive and deeply strange. The atmosphere inside was crisply cool, while the desert night waited outside. And then the football began, and it was extraordinary. Saudi Arabia beat Argentina 2-1 in one of the greatest upsets in World Cup history, a result so improbable that early photographs of the Saudi fans' celebration became some of the most widely shared images of the tournament. Argentina, the favourites, had lost to Saudi Arabia. The world had to sit with that for a while. Argentina regrouped. Messi, at 35 years old, appeared to understand that this was his final World Cup and played with a combination of urgency and clarity that transcended the merely excellent. He scored goals, created goals, and led his team with a visible intensity of purpose that communicated something beyond tactics or technique. He was playing for something.
Morocco produced the single most remarkable national journey in World Cup history. The first African and first Arab nation ever to reach a World Cup semi-final. They beat Spain on penalties, eliminated Portugal in the quarterfinals, and did so on a wave of popular support, not just from Moroccans, but from across the Arab world and much of Africa. Tens of millions of people watching matches through the night in countries where their team was not technically competing, but where Morocco had become everyone's second team. When Morocco beat Portugal to reach the semi-finals, the scenes in Rabat and Casablanca and Dakar and Cairo and Amman were of a scale and an emotional charge that the World Cup, at its best, has always been capable of generating. Morocco eventually lost to France in the semi-final, but left the tournament as a team whose achievement deserved to be spoken of alongside the greatest upsets and advances in the competition's history. The final, played on the 18th of December 2022 at the Lusail Stadium outside Doha at an attendance of almost 90,000 between Argentina and France and contested over 120 minutes of extraordinary drama before eventually going to penalties, may be the greatest football match ever played at a World Cup. That is a large claim, and the game of the century between Italy and West Germany in 1970 would contest it. But December 2022 had specific qualities that make the comparison at minimum plausible.
Argentina took the lead through a Messi penalty in the 23rd minute. Di Maria scored a second goal with a sweeping finish just before half-time. France were being outplayed, their best players subdued, Mbappé quiet, Griezmann peripheral. Argentina looked entirely in control heading into the final quarter of the match. 2-0, the World Cup within their reach, Messi's redemption minutes away. Then Kylian Mbappé scored in the 80th minute with a penalty. And 90 seconds later, with Argentina still concussed, Mbappé scored again, a left-footed volley of violent precision, one of the finest goals ever scored in a World Cup final. In 190 seconds, France had gone from 2 goals behind to level. Mbappé had scored twice in 2 minutes of the final to equalise. The Argentine players stood on the pitch with the specific expression of people who cannot quite process what is happening to them. The penalty shootout that followed was contested through a nerve of global collective tension. 3 billion people watching screens in every time zone. The Argentine goalkeeper Emiliano Martinez producing a save of extraordinary reflexes when the French substitute Randal Kolo Muani appeared certain to score in the final seconds of extra time. A moment that may have been the single most important save in a World Cup final. Martinez saved twice in the shootout as well. Argentina won 4 penalties to 2. Gonzalo Montiel struck the winning penalty. Messi collapsed to his knees and then was swallowed by teammates and staff. The image of Messi lifting the World Cup trophy, wrapped in the traditional Qatari bisht robe that the Emir of Qatar placed over his shoulders before the presentation, a garment of honor and ceremony, became one of the most reproduced sports photographs in history. Whatever one thought of the tournament's location and the process by which it had been awarded, the football and the final and the specific emotional story of Messi finally winning the thing that had evaded him for so long produced something genuine, something that transcended circumstance. Peter Drury, the English commentator, whose language at moments of sporting significance achieves a quality almost of poetry, said simply, "Lionel Messi has shaken hands with paradise." It was perhaps the best description available. Section 15. The men behind the moments. Managers, tactics, and the invisible architecture of the World Cup.
For all the goals and the glory and the names that echo across decades, the World Cup has always been shaped as much by the people who do not play as by those who do. The managers, the coaches, the tacticians in their dugouts, the architects of systems and formations and methods that determine how 11 players arrange themselves on a field and what they are asked to do with each other and with the ball. Understanding the World Cup fully means spending a little time with these figures, these mostly quiet men whose ideas shaped the way the game was played and whose decisions, made in the technical areas of stadiums on the largest stages in world sport, determine the course of nations and the shape of history. Vittorio Pozzo managed Italy to 2 consecutive World Cup victories in 1934 and 1938, a record of consecutive tournament wins that has never been equaled. Pozzo was a product of a particular early 20th century European football culture, having studied at Bradford City in England before the First World War, and absorbed the English passion for organized, physical, purposeful play. He combined this with Italian technical refinement and a fierce insistence on tactical discipline and physical conditioning that were unusual for the era. His players were expected to know not just their own roles, but the roles of every other person on the field. He watched training with intense, unblinking attention and corrected mistakes immediately, not with shouts, but with careful, specific language that left the corrected player in no doubt about what needed to change and why. He was also a man of his time, working directly within the framework of Mussolini's regime, in ways that subsequent history makes difficult to view without complication. But he remains nonetheless one of the most successful and technically sophisticated football managers the game has produced. Rinus Michels, the Dutch coach who developed total football at Ajax, and then brought it to the Dutch national team for the 1974 and 1978 World Cups, is widely credited by football historians as one of the most influential tactical minds the game has produced. His system demanded complete football intelligence from every player, the capacity to play multiple positions, to read space, to anticipate movement, to switch roles fluidly without the ball going out of play. Michels was known as the General, a nickname that reflected his absolute insistence on discipline and his tendency to conduct training sessions with a kind of military precision that could be quite frightening for young players encountering it for the first time. He had a directness of manner that brooked no argument, and a clarity of vision that communicated itself to his players with immediate force.
He later managed Barcelona and the Dutch national team again for their 1988 European Championship triumph, and by that point his influence had spread through every serious football culture in the world.
Brazil has produced many coaches of genius, but perhaps none more celebrated within the country than Mario Zagallo, who was unique in having won the World Cup as both a player and as a manager. Zagallo won in 1958 and 1962 as a player, and then managed the 1970 squad, meaning he was present for 3 of Brazil's 5 World Cup triumphs. He was known as O Velho Lobo, the Old Wolf, a nickname acknowledging his longevity and his cunning. And he approached tactics with a flexibility and a willingness to build systems around specific individual talents that was ahead of its time. The 1970 squad was, in his own assessment, beyond his control in the conventional managerial sense, a collection of so much individual genius that his primary task was simply to create the conditions in which they could express themselves freely, to remove obstacles rather than to impose structures, to trust the players and let the football flow from that trust.
Cesar Luis Menotti, who managed Argentina to their 1978 triumph, was an intellectual and a romantic in a football context that was often neither. He believed sincerely that football at its finest was an art form, that it had obligations toward beauty as well as toward winning, and he built his Argentine team around these principles. His philosophical writings about football were read seriously in Argentina as cultural documents as well as tactical ones, and he attracted the loyalty of players who responded to his conviction that how you played was as important as whether you won. The irony of winning a World Cup under a junta he opposed politically was something Menotti lived with by maintaining as clearly as possible that the football was separate from the politics, a distinction the junta was happy to exploit and that critics were understandably reluctant to grant him. Carlos Bilardo, who managed Argentina to the 1986 World Cup title, was Menotti's philosophical opposite in almost every respect. Where Menotti was idealistic, Bilardo was ruthless. Where Menotti sought beauty, Bilardo sought results by any means available. He was known for conducting training sessions of extraordinary intensity and duration, for analyzing opponents in exhaustive detail, and for a win-at-all-costs philosophy that generated controversy even within Argentine football culture. He deserves enormous credit nonetheless for constructing a team around Maradona in a way that maximized Maradona's gifts without making the structure entirely dependent on them, so that when Maradona was not at his absolute best, Argentina could still function as a coherent, dangerous unit capable of winning football matches against the best opposition in the world. Joachim Löw managed Germany for 15 years, from 2006 to 2021, winning the World Cup in 2014 and building the methodical, technically excellent squad that produced the 7 goals against Brazil in Belo Horizonte. Löw was a product of the German football revolution that followed the country's dismal performance at the 2000 European Championship, when a systematic overhaul of youth development produced a generation of technically refined, tactically intelligent players who differed sharply from the powerful but relatively limited German players of earlier eras. Müller, Kroos, Özil, Khedira, Neuer. The players that Löw had access to for the 2014 World Cup represented the fruit of a decade-long national investment in youth football, and the 7 goals against Brazil in the semi-final were, in a very specific sense, the product of an entire philosophical shift in German football culture, rather than merely the product of a single exceptional evening. Lionel Scaloni managed Argentina
to the 2022 World Cup title, despite having been viewed with considerable skepticism when he was appointed to the role in 2018, with no prior senior managerial experience of note. Scaloni proved over 4 years to be an extremely astute man manager and tactical organizer, constructing a team whose defensive solidity provided the platform for Messi to play with the freedom that his talent demanded, while surrounded by teammates who understood their roles with complete clarity. Argentina went 47 competitive matches unbeaten under Scaloni before the shock of the Saudi Arabia defeat in Qatar, and the way they recovered from that shock to win the whole tournament spoke volumes about the resilience and the self-belief that Scaloni had built into his squad across 4 years of careful, consistent work. Section 16. The Tournament Beyond the Trophy. Underdogs, Discoveries, and the stories the scorelines cannot contain.
The World Cup has always been more than the competition for the trophy itself. It has always been a place where stories accumulate at the margins of the main narrative, where small nations make their moments of glory against all reasonable expectation, where individual careers are made or broken in 90 minutes, where the larger world of politics and culture and history presses against the white lines of the football pitch with irresistible force. Some of these stories deserve a little more of our attention before the night fully closes in.
North Korea's appearance at the 1966 World Cup in England is one of the great curiosities of tournament history. North Korea was in 1966 one of the most isolated and secretive regimes on earth, a country about which most of the watching world knew almost nothing, whose players arrived in England as complete unknowns and were welcomed with a degree of general condescension that they proceeded to dismantle with some force. They beat Italy 1-0 in the group stage, putting the Italians out of the tournament in a result that stunned the football world, and then led Portugal 3-0 in the quarter-final, before Eusebio rescued his country with a performance of individual brilliance that remains among the finest in World Cup history. The North Korean players' brief time in England, particularly in Middlesbrough where they were based, and where local people took to them with unexpected warmth, became the subject of a documentary film 40 years later, when a group of Middlesbrough residents found their old photographs of the team and set off to track down the players, now elderly men, in Pyongyang. The film that resulted is one of the most moving documents football has produced, a record of a brief, improbable flowering of human connection between people from opposite ends of the world who had been brought together by a tournament and by a game.
Cameroon in 1990 began a tradition of African football that World Cups have celebrated and extended ever since. The indomitable Lions, managed by a Soviet coach named Valery Nepomniachtchi, who spoke no French and communicated with his players through an interpreter, beat Argentina in the opening match and proceeded through the tournament on a wave of physical dynamism and collective belief that captured the imagination of neutrals across the world. Roger Milla, their striker, who performed his corner flag dance after every goal, was 38 years old, according to his official birth certificate, though his own mother was quoted as suggesting he might have been older still, a detail that somehow only added to his legend. He came off the bench in match after match to score decisive goals with a freshness and a joy that seemed entirely uncomplicated by the weight of expectation or the awareness of his own age. England eventually stopped them in the quarter-final, but not before Cameroon had permanently changed the perception of African football on the global stage and given the tournament one of its most beloved figures. Senegal in 2002 beat France in the opening match of the tournament and reached the quarter-finals in their very first World Cup appearance, led by El Hadji Diouf and managed by Bruno Metsu, a Frenchman who had worked extensively in African football and who built his team around a combination of physical intensity and collective discipline. Their celebration after beating the defending champions in the opening game, the players dancing on the pitch together in the sole rain, each player finding a partner and moving with complete, uninhibited joy, became one of the tournament's defining images of the modern era. Their quarter-final defeat to Turkey on a golden goal in extra time was genuinely heartbreaking, the more so for how narrowly it came and how well they had played throughout. Ghana in 2010 in South Africa came within a penalty kick of reaching the World Cup semi-final and very nearly becoming the first African nation to do so, when Uruguay's Luis Suarez deliberately handled the ball on the goal line in the final seconds of extra time to prevent a certain goal. Asamoah Gyan, Ghana's striker, struck the resulting penalty against the crossbar. The game went to a penalty shootout that Uruguay won. Suarez celebrated on the touchline with an expression that football supporters of a particular persuasion found entirely appropriate and those of another found deeply unsportsmanlike. And the incident became one of the most discussed moments of competitive ethics in the tournament's history. Ghana went home. The moment has remained raw for Ghanaian football fans ever since.
Iceland's appearance at the 2018 World Cup in Russia was a source of disproportionate joy for much of the watching world. A country of roughly 330,000 people competing at the highest level of international football, having already reached the quarter-finals of the European Championship 2 years earlier in one of sport's great collective achievements. Their goalkeeper, Hannes Halldórsson, was a film director in his other professional life. Their centre-backs were a construction engineer and a saltfish merchant in their working lives outside football. They drew with Argentina in the group stage, a result that included Messi missing a penalty, and they performed the thunderclap celebration that had originated with their club supporters and had become one of the most joyful and widely imitated celebrations in the game. They did not progress from the group stage, but their brief presence felt like exactly what football at its best can be: small and unexpected, arriving on the same stage as large and famous, and refusing to be diminished by the comparison.
Morocco in 2022 in Qatar made history of a different and larger kind. The Atlas Lions became the first African nation, the first Arab nation, the first team from the African continent since Senegal in 2002 to reach the quarter-finals of a World Cup. And then they went further, eliminating Spain on penalties and then Portugal in the quarter-final to become the first African and Arab nation ever to reach a World Cup semi-final. The scenes that accompanied each of their victories in Qatar, not just among Moroccan supporters, but across the Arab world and across Africa, were of a scale and emotional charge that reminded watching people everywhere of what sport at its most unrestricted and communal can feel like. In Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Senegal, in Nigeria, people celebrated Morocco's victories as if their own team had won. The collective ownership of a sporting achievement, the projection of national and continental pride onto a single team's journey was one of the most powerful things the 2022 tournament produced. And then there are the journalists and the commentators who gave the World Cup its language of memory. The phrases and the voices that people associate with specific moments
tend to attach themselves permanently and become part of how those moments are understood. Kenneth Wolstenholme's They Think It Is All Over at Wembley in 1966. Victor Hugo Morales rhapsodizing over Maradona's second goal in 1986. Peter Drury's Lionel Messi Has Shaken Hands with Paradise in Lusail in 2022. These moments of language are not incidental to the World Cup's history. They are the form in which the World Cup's history is carried forward, the words that people reach for when they want to say what it felt like to witness something extraordinary.
The volunteers who staffed World Cups across 9 decades, the translators and drivers and stewards and medical staff, the local organizing committees who transformed bids into stadiums and roads and transport links, the people who printed programs and prepared pitches and served food and maintained the physical fabric of tournaments in 14 different countries across nearly a century. None of them lifted the trophy. Many of them gave years of their lives to making it possible. The World Cup has always been a collective human project of extraordinary ambition and complexity, and its survival across wars and economic crises and political upheavals and institutional scandals says something about the depth of the human investment in it, something about the fact that the idea of the tournament, the vision that Jules Rimet carried aboard a ship in 1930, proved to be more durable than any of the particular circumstances that surrounded its individual editions.
Approximately 3.5 billion people watched the 2022 World Cup, nearly half of the entire human population of the planet. The number is almost impossible to hold in the mind. 3.5 billion people watching the same thing, feeling the same escalation of tension, the same release of joy or grief. There is no other event in human experience that achieves this. Not a political summit, not an artistic performance, not a scientific announcement. The World Cup, once every 4 years, briefly makes the human world feel like a single community, oriented toward a single thing. It has given us moments that exist outside of sport. Gordon Banks diving low to scoop Pele's header to safety. Carlos Alberto striking the ball into the corner in Mexico City. Maradona running at England for 60 meters and scoring the goal of the century. Baggio's head bowing after the penalty that sailed over the bar. Gazza's tears in Turin. Zidane's headbutt in Berlin. Mbappe's 2 goals in 90 seconds in Lusail. These moments live in the shared memory of billions of people who were there, or watched, or heard, or were told by a parent or a grandparent who had been there. It has also given us ugliness, corruption, controversial decisions, human rights crises, and the persistent reminder that sport does not exist outside of politics or power or money, and that the institutions of sport are imperfect in the same ways that all human institutions are imperfect. The World Cup has been used by dictators as propaganda. It has been awarded through processes that courts have found to involve criminal conduct. It has taken place in conditions that created serious harm for people who had no choice about their involvement. These facts sit alongside the beautiful football, and they should not be forgotten. And yet the ball is placed on the penalty spot.
The goalkeeper shuffles on the line. The crowd holds its breath. 3 billion people hold their breath. The player steps forward, and for a moment the world is very still. That stillness, that collective suspension of everything else in favor of this one moment, this shared human experience of waiting together for something that might be wonderful or might be terrible, is what the World Cup has made possible. Jules Rimet, boarding a ship in Marseille in June of 1930 with a golden trophy in a suitcase, might have imagined something like it. He could not possibly have imagined the scale. The tournament that began with 13 nations crossing oceans by ship to meet on a field in Montevideo has become the largest shared moment in human civilization. It will continue. The 2026 World Cup will produce its own Maracanazo, its own goal of the century, its own Gazza's tears. Someone will step forward and strike a penalty that decides everything. 3 billion people will hold their breath. That is the World Cup. That is what it means. That is why we remember it.
The weight of 4 years. There is one more thing worth saying in these quiet hours as the World Cup's history settles around us like the last embers of a long fire. The 4-year gap between tournaments is not incidental to what the World Cup means, it is essential to it. 4 years is long enough for children to grow into teenagers, for teenagers to grow into young adults, for careers to begin and end and be remembered or forgotten. 4 years is long enough for the world to change, for new players to emerge from unknown places and announce themselves on the global stage, for old champions to age into retirement, for the stories that will define the next tournament to begin assembling themselves in the months and years before anyone knows what those stories will be. In those 4 years between tournaments, football continues everywhere. Club matches are played, domestic leagues cycle through their seasons, and European nights in October and March carry their own specific quality of drama. But the World Cup waits. It gathers itself. It allows anticipation to build across a period long enough that the anticipation itself becomes a kind of pleasure, the slow, sustained pleasure that makes the event feel earned when it finally arrives.
The qualifying campaigns that precede each World Cup are themselves a kind of tournament within the tournament, months of matches across every continent through which nations prove their right to be present, through which the map of the eventual tournament is drawn, through which unexpected stories emerge. A small island nation qualifying for the first time, a traditional power failing to qualify and facing the consequences of that failure with varying degrees of grace or agony, the slow accumulation of results across 2 years of qualifying that finally resolve into the confirmed list of 32 or 48 teams who will be on the plane. And then the draw. The ceremony in which the groups are determined, the paths through the brackets sketched out in broad strokes, the commentators and analysts and fans beginning immediately to trace the possible trajectories, to imagine the quarterfinals and the semi-finals and the final before a ball has been kicked. The World Cup draw is one of international football's most ceremonially elaborate occasions, always held in a large venue, always attended by legendary former players and officials, always generating enormous coverage and enormous speculation. It is the World Cup's formal announcement that it is coming a few months hence and that the shape of it is now known. Then, eventually, the opening match.
The ceremony, the national anthems, the first whistle, the first kick, and the sudden, relieved confirmation that it is actually happening, that the thing that has been anticipated for 4 years is now in motion, that the stories are being written in real time, that the World Cup is here again.
The first World Cup winner was Uruguay in 1930. The most recent World Cup winner is Argentina in 2022. Between those two dates, across those 92 years, in 13 countries on 5 continents, something remarkable happened over and over again. The world came together to play football and to watch football and to feel, however briefly and however imperfectly, that it was a single community capable of sharing something profound. That is the World Cup's deepest achievement. That is what Jules Rimet's dream, carried across the Atlantic in a suitcase in June 1930, ultimately became. A final word on what the World Cup asks of us. There is a particular kind of sleep that follows a World Cup final. Not the heavy, dreamless sleep of exhaustion, but something lighter and stranger, populated by fragments of what was just watched, by that last save or that final penalty, or the image of a player lifting the trophy while tears ran down their face. The World Cup has always generated this quality of experience, this residue of feeling that lingers past the final whistle and into the hours that follow.
People who attended the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, who were present in the Azteca Stadium for Brazil's final against Italy, described for decades afterwards the quality of the light in the stadium that evening, the specific sound of Carlos Alberto's shot, the way the crowd's noise transformed in the seconds after the ball hit the net into something that seemed to come from deeper than simple sporting celebration, something that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what they had witnessed together. The memory of that light, that sound, stayed with those people for the rest of their lives. Many of them described it as one of the purest experiences of collective joy they had ever had. The 1990 World Cup in Italy gave people Gazza's tears, and those tears gave permission to millions of men who had been told that football was something you watched with stoic composure to admit that it moved them, that it reached something in them, that it mattered in ways that went beyond sport. Paul Gascoigne did not intend to create a cultural shift when he wept in the Turin Stadium. He was simply a 23-year-old man who had just realized that he might not be allowed to play in the final he had worked his whole career toward. But the authenticity of that grief, transmitted through cameras to millions of homes, landed somewhere real and stayed there.
The 2022 World Cup in Qatar gave people the image of Messi in the bisht, the traditional Qatari garment that was placed over his shoulders before he lifted the trophy. A garment that initially divided opinion, with some feeling that it obscured the clarity of the moment, and others feeling that it added to the ceremony's dignity, before everyone mostly agreed that what mattered was the expression on Messi's face, the tears that he did not quite manage to hold back, the specific quality of relief and joy and exhaustion that seemed to say that this man had been carrying something for a very long time and had now finally been allowed to put it down. These moments accumulate across decades, and they build something larger than any single tournament or any single career or any single nation's triumph. They build a shared reference library of human feeling, a collective memory of what it looks and sounds and feels like when sport becomes briefly indistinguishable from life itself,
when the outcome of a game suddenly seems to carry the weight of everything that matters. This is the World Cup's gift to the world, and it renews itself every 4 years.
The road to 2026 stretches ahead. New players are emerging. New nations are qualifying. New stadiums are being prepared. New stories are in the process of being written by people who do not yet know what their stories will be. A striker who is 12 years old right now, kicking a ball in a dusty street in some city on some continent, will play in a World Cup. A goalkeeper who is 15 and who has never been watched by anyone with the authority to change their life will be noticed, evaluated, trained, developed, and will one day stand on the goal line of a World Cup match and try to guess which direction the penalty is going. None of that has happened yet. All of it is coming. The World Cup is patient. It waits and it gathers, and every 4 years it offers the world the same extraordinary invitation. Come together, watch something beautiful and tense and sometimes heartbreaking and occasionally transcendent. And remember that whatever else divides us, this game is something we share. That is worth sleeping on. That is worth dreaming about. Good night.
The ball is always somewhere in the world. On a beach, on a street, in a gymnasium, on a schoolyard, being kicked by someone who is practicing, or by someone who is playing for the pure pleasure of it, or by someone who is 11 years old and already dreaming of a stage they have seen on television and that seems impossibly far away. The World Cup lives in those moments too, in the aspiration and the practice and the dream that precedes the tournament by years and decades. It lives in every young player who watches a World Cup final and thinks that they want to be there someday, that they want to feel what those players are feeling, that they want to know what it is like to stand in the middle of the largest human gathering ever assembled for a sporting event, and to do the thing they have practiced since childhood. The World Cup began with a ship crossing the Atlantic and 13 teams gathering in a South American city. It has grown into something that touches the lives of half the people on Earth every 4 years. The distance between those two things is one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of human culture. It is a journey worth knowing, and now, quietly, gently, with the history of the beautiful game settling around you like a warm and heavy thing, it is a journey worth sleeping on.